President Putin announced that Russia is officially withdrawing from the last remaining arms treaty, which is called the New START agreement. There you see it, as a result of what he perceives as NATO and EU aggression that has been going on for many years. There's the Reuters article, and it reads, quote, President Vladimir Putin said on Tuesday that Russia was suspending its participation in the New START treaty with the United States that limits the two sides' strategic nuclear arsenals. Putin stressed that Russia was not withdrawing from the treaty, but the suspension further imperils the last remaining pillar of arms control between the United States and Russia, which between them hold nearly 90% of the world's nuclear warheads, enough to destroy the planet many, many times over. Quote, in this regard, I am forced to announce today that Russia is suspending its participation in the Strategic Offensive Arms Treaty, Putin told lawmakers toward the end of a major speech to parliament nearly 1 year into the war. Now, maybe you don't care much about arms treaties, but I think it's important to review the history of these arms treaties and why many people thought they were very important, beginning with President Ronald Reagan himself. The Reuters article goes on, quote, the New START treaty was signed in Prague in 2010, came into force the following year, and was extended in 2021 for 5 years more, just after U.S. President Joe Biden took office. It caps the number of strategic nuclear warheads that the United States and Russia can deploy, and the deployment of land and submarine-based missiles and bombers to deliver them. Russia has the largest stockpile of nuclear weapons in the world, with close to 6,000 warheads, experts say. So these agreements take the two countries that have so many different kinds of nuclear weapons, nuclear-tipped intercontinental ballistic missiles, nuclear submarines, they're all over the place. And these arms treaties and the framework of them, which again was begun in the 1980s between Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev and has been supported by people all over the world and both political parties for decades, because it's a pretty serious matter to have nuclear weapons just strewn about all over the world with no one controlling how they're used or where they are or how many there are deployed. That's what these arms agreements are for, these nuclear arms agreements. And so one of the problems, one of the costs of this proxy war that we're now in for about a year, it's about to be a year on February 24th, is that it is now completely destroying whatever remnants of diplomacy exists between the United States and Russia. Again, the countries with 90% of the nuclear stockpile on the planet. As ABC reports, quote, Russian lawmakers endorse suspension of nuclear pact with the U.S. Both houses of Russia's parliament have quickly endorsed President Vladimir Putin's move to suspend the last remaining nuclear arms treaty with the United States. Now, according to AP, what is happening as the Russian parliament and as Vladimir Putin withdraw from that arms treaty is former Russian president and the current top national security advisor to President Putin, Dmitry Medvedev. He came out once again and explicitly warned, in case you just don't believe it's true, they're trying to explicitly say that Russia will use their nuclear weapons if they begin to lose what they actually regard, whether you agree with it or not, what they regard as an existential war. If they start to lose a war right on the Ukrainian border and perceive that NATO and the West is overrunning Ukraine and deploying their military right up into the Russian border, they are telling the world, in terms that the United States should understand, since we would do the same thing if this were happening in Cuba or Mexico or Canada, or even anywhere in Latin America, that they regard it as a threat sufficient enough to them to deploy nuclear weapons. Quote, Dmitry Medvedev, deputy head of Russia's Security Council that is chaired by Putin, emphasized that the suspension of Russia's participation in the pact was a signal to the U.S. that Moscow is ready to use nuclear weapons to protect itself. Quote, if the U.S. wants Russia's defeat, we have the right to defend ourselves with any weapons, including nuclear, Medvedev said on his messaging app channel. Quote, let the U.S. elites who have lost touch with reality think about what they got. If the U.S. wants Russia to be defeated, we are going to stand on the verge of a global conflict. Leonid Slutsky, the head of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the lower house, the State Duma, the Russian parliament, emphasized that the suspension is, quote, reversible and can be reviewed if our Western opponents come back to reason and realize their responsibility for destroying the global security system. Now, maybe you're somebody, and there definitely are a lot of people who say, look, I don't care about what Russia does. I don't care if they withdraw from every single arms control agreement they have with us. I don't care if they threaten to use nuclear weapons. For some reason, this country, all the way on the other side of the world, that has no oil reserves and no geostrategic importance to the United States, a country that President Barack Obama himself repeatedly said, when attacked by neocons in both parties for not doing enough to defend Ukraine, he would always say, why would I risk a war with Russia over Ukraine? Ukraine is a country that's of vital interest to Russia, but it has been and never will be to the United States. I guess if you think that that country is so important, that who rules the Donbass and the eastern regions and provinces of Ukraine is so vital to your life, that you're willing to risk all of these things, then okay, but let's at least hear from Ronald Reagan about, despite what a hardened cold warrior he was, despite his view that the Soviet Union, not Russia, but the Soviet Union, vastly larger than today's Russia, much, much more threatening with a much bigger military, was a genuine existential threat to the United States. Notwithstanding his view on that, he was adamant that nuclear arms agreements were vital to the security of the United States and of the world. Let's listen to just one of the times he said so early in his presidency in 1982.
Mothers of a new generation must have worried about their children and about peace. And that's what I'd like to talk to you about tonight. The future of our children in a world where peace is made uneasy by the presence of nuclear weapons. I believe our strategy for peace will succeed. Never before has the United States proposed such a comprehensive program of nuclear arms control. Never in our history have we engaged in so many negotiations with the Soviets to reduce nuclear arms and to find a stable peace. What we are saying to them is this: we will modernize our military in order to keep the balance for peace. But wouldn't it be better if we both simply reduced our arsenals to a much lower level? This summer, we also began negotiations on strategic arms reductions, the proposal we call START. Here we're talking about intercontinental missiles, the weapons with a longer range than the intermediate range ones I was just discussing. We're negotiating on the basis of deep reductions. I proposed in May that we cut the number of warheads on these missiles to an equal number, roughly 1/3 below current levels. I also proposed that we cut the number of missiles themselves to an equal number, about half the current U.S. level. Our proposals would eliminate some 4,700 warheads and some 2,250 missiles. I think that would be quite a service to mankind.
That would be quite a service to mankind, said the person who ran on a platform of challenging the Soviet Union and denouncing it as the evil empire. And he was trying to get the country to understand that the situation that Russia and the United States face because of these nuclear weapons, which, by the way, 40 years later are vastly more destructive and powerful than even they were then when Ronald Reagan was warning about them, and way more powerful still than when the United States used them twice in 1945 in Japan. He was trying to get people to understand, as much as I believe the Soviet Union is a country that needs to be challenged in every conceivable way, we are much better and safer as a country if we're able to sit down with them, despite all the rhetoric flying back and forth between us, and negotiate these START agreements, these arms control agreements that will at least place some degree of security and, as he used to say, trust but verify, verification systems on the number of nuclear warheads aimed at one another's cities that would just make the world a much less dangerous place. And again, Reagan was somebody willing to challenge the Soviet Union in all kinds of ways with dirty wars and covert wars, and anytime he thought the communists were getting too close to the United States, in the backyard that he considered Latin America to be, never mind right on the other side of the border, he was emphasizing the importance of this arms control regime that is now unraveling almost completely. And over what? A war in Ukraine, over a fight over whether Zelensky will govern the Donbass, or it will be independent, or will decide, like Kosovo did, that it wants to be subject to the rule of Moscow, or like Crimea did. Kosovo opted for independence. Now, the START agreement itself, START 1, let's bring this up, was signed on July 31st, 1991. I think it's very important to review the history of this so we don't become dismissive about the importance of these agreements. They were signed in 1981. That was when George Bush, 41, was president, by the United States and the Soviet Union. This is the first treaty that required U.S. and Soviet-Russian reductions of strategic nuclear weapons. It was indispensable in creating a framework that ensured predictability and stability for deep reductions. In 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved, leaving 4 independent states in possession of strategic nuclear weapons: Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan. This caused a delay in the entry into the force of the treaty. On May 23, 1992, the United States and the 4 nuclear-capable successor states to the Soviet Union signed the Lisbon Protocol, which made all 5 nations party to the START I agreement. Reductions of nuclear weapons were completed by the deadline of December 5, 2001. 7 years after entry into force, and maintained for another 8 years. States were verified by on-site inspections and shared military telemetry. Both the United States and the Russian Federation continued reduction efforts even after reaching the START limits. That's how successful they were. All of these countries with very different antagonisms and very different interests not only sat down and complied, but continued to voluntarily do it even further, knowing how dangerous these nuclear weapons were. Then we get into the New START agreement, which is the one that President Putin just abandoned. That one did the following, quote, "New START continues the bipartisan process of verifiably reducing U.S. and Russian strategic nuclear arsenals, begun by former Presidents Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. New START is the first verifiable U.S.-Russian nuclear arms control treaty to take effect since START I in 1994. The United States and Russia agreed on February 3, 2021 to extend New START by 5 years as allowed by the treaty and a text until February 5, 2026. And now that's what has been put into doubt and suspended. So look at all the costs. You have the financial cost of $100 billion and more. You have the United States depleting its own military stockpiles and now having to buy enormous amounts from Raytheon and Boeing and General Dynamics and all the countries that always profit whenever wars begin. I had Matt Gaetz on my show last week, and I asked him, why is the United States so obsessed with Ukraine, as it's been since at least 2013, if not before, when Victoria Nuland was running that country for the Obama administration the way she now is for the Biden administration. And he told me that Goldman Sachs and all of these hedge funds and banks see Ukraine as an incredibly profitable opportunity because of how corrupt it is. So we're pouring hundreds of billions of dollars, or $100 billion authorized thus far, tons of weapons, right exactly 6 months after these arms manufacturers finally lost their major market in the war on terror when we withdrew from Afghanistan. Lo and behold, there's a new war. So we're putting all those costs, just financial costs, into it. We're depleting our own stockpiles. We're unraveling the nuclear arms reduction agreements that President Ronald Reagan started and himself said was indispensable to future generations living a safe and secure life on the planet. And on top of that, China is now making gestures toward getting more involved with Russia, seeing that the entire West and all of NATO is backing up the Ukrainians and believing that it's necessary to at least bring some balance, and that's causing China to seemingly get more involved in supporting Russia, either indirectly or by providing the kinds of arms that the United States is providing. Now, obviously, the United States is now threatening China that they better not do what the United States is already doing in this war, which is providing lethal arms. My favorite headline that I've ever seen was from 2007, when the United States denounced Iran for, quote, interfering in Iraq, even though the United States was in Iraq with about 200,000 troops, a country that it had invaded just 4 years earlier, was warning and denouncing Iran for interfering in a country right on the other side of its border when the United States went all the way to the other side of the world to invade that country. And now the United States is warning China, you better stay out of Ukraine. You better stay away from Russia. And of course, the Chinese are now saying, we're not going to have you dictate to us what kind of relationship we can have with Moscow. And that's raising tensions between Washington and Beijing. And as always, the overarching question is, for what? For what? Who is benefiting from this war? If the people of the Donbass region and other provinces in eastern Ukraine are allowed to have a free and fair election that the UN supervises, and they decide they want to be independent from the rule of Kiev and are granted their independence the way Kosovo was, or they decide they want to be part of Moscow because they're Russian speaking and identify as ethnic Russians and are allowed to go and be under the rule of Moscow, what is that to you? How does that improve your life in any way to have all of your tax-paying money transferred to Ukraine and have us fuel a war there? How is that helping your life? And conversely, how will it harm your life if the United States plays the role of trying to forge a diplomatic resolution to this war instead of preventing diplomacy and fueling the war for its own interest, for the interest of a tiny sliver of the population, namely people who work in the arms industry, who are big shareholders and executives in it, and people who work in the U.S. security state who always see their authority and budgets balloon whenever there's a war like this. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update. Catch our full shows for free, live weekdays at 7 p.m. Eastern on Rumble, and join our locals community at greenwald.locals.com for all of my written journalism, exclusive after-show Q&As, and more.